Andy attended more than one drama school. That evening, Gilbert Pantomimic had a date. The woman, Andy Triptofit, was an actress with the Kleptomagic Theater Group. Gilbert shared an apartment with his sister. The fact that he hadn't seen her all day and had no idea where she was did not bother him at all. Haley was often gone for days on secret union business, and besides, this meant that he and Andy could have the apartment to themselves. After the movie, The Potato That Ate Mr. Ragland, which lasted far longer than Gilbert expected or desired, he and Andy had dinner at a cheap but exotic restaurant whose cuisine was of some bizarre ethnic derivation. Finally, the two arrived back at the apartment. "I really liked that restaurant," Andy confessed for the third or fourth time since exiting the place. "I thought you would," Gilbert said as he scanned the music on offer. "Artists and actors often have more open minds than the average person. I can't drag my sister there." At this reminder of the absent sister whom Gilbert had told Andy shared the apartment, she looked around for evidence of her habitation. Yes, there was a picture of a bowl of flowers, and there a stack of laundered, folded women's clothes. "Which one is her room?" Andy asked. Gilbert looked up. He had decided on an old album by James Taylor. Just the right touch, he thought. He nodded towards the hall. "The one on the left," he said. "Can I look?" "Sure. I'm going to put some music on, okay?" "That sounds great," Andy replied, rising from the sofa and heading towards the hall. Gilbert took advantage of the interval to knock back a swallow of scotch. As Andy peered into the typical, if slightly severe, girl's bedroom and compared it to the contrasting vision represented by Gilbert's room across the hall, she heard voices. "What's wrong with you?" Gilbert demanded of Haley, who stood unsteadily in the kitchen, pale and haggard. Scouring the corner. Prince Hopshi's best agent, Green Purbrick, an ugly, evil man, and not one you'd want your daughter spending time with, although he was exactly the kind of man that women are inexplicably attracted to, much to the bafflement and consternation of guys like you and me. Sat in the window of a disused office across the street from the corner where Malcolm Jamaica was expected to put in an appearance. "With any luck," Prince Hopshi had told Purbrick, "we'll be able to find out who the cartel is using to contact this man." "I already know what you want done with Jamaica." Purbrick worked his tongue at a piece of goat meat stuck between his teeth. Incongruously, they were pearly white. One would have expected, at least I would have, from my childish vantage point, his thug's face to be set with a drunkenly crooked assembly of chompers resembling kernels of boiled yellow corn. "What about whoever meets him?" "The same thing," Prince Hopshi replied. "Then I'll have to take care of him first." Purbrick had enough respect for his employer's wealth and power to spit the freed food particle into a rag and not on the floor. This consideration was not given to many. "Why's that?" "Because dealing with Jamaica is going to take some time." Prince Hopshi paced to a 3,000-year-old vase on the pedestal. "You think he's that good?" he asked, his eyes on the scene of debauchery painted on the vase's surface. "From what I've heard," Purbrick answered. I've never met him myself, but I know people who've seen him in action." The prince considered. "Interesting," he commented. Green Purbrick massaged his unusually developed forearms as he sat in the window. The tattoo of the snarling two-headed leopard was further up on his right bicep, concealed beneath the sleeve of his black silk t-shirt. He owned a motorcycle and lived in a treehouse. The thoughts that ran through his head were abstracted images of wealth in black and white. The kangarooic handle nicely that forgotten aplomb. Currently, the Kleptomagic Theater Group was readying the play Ducky's Folding Hammer for performance. This would be their first production in their new theater, a gift from Stan Chandler, an alumnus of the Kleptomagic, now a big star on a hit television program. Andy Triptofit had secured the role of Grinka, a partially flightless asthmatic, whose bakery always seemed to run out of pastries before Drake, an occasional customer and would-be cartoonist, could purchase one. To perform the role properly, Andy was practicing a vaguely Slavic accent. She put wooden clogs on her feet and went downtown, speaking in character to everyone she ran into. "Andy," Carmela Quintabos greeted the actress cheerily. "Don't those shoes hurt?" "Why, yes, they hurt me very much," Andy replied. "What's wrong with your mouth? Did you put clogs on your tongue as well?" "No, Carmela, I am practicing for a play." And so it went all week long, Andy driving people crazy, but also enduring their good-natured ribbing. Ribbing is usually good-natured. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but it's true. It's probably redundant to add the good-natured part. I could probably just write ribbing, and you'd probably assume that it was gentle and friendly in nature. The play, written by Diologus the Elder in the 18th century, concerned the introduction of the folding hammer into an isolated village by the trickster Ducky and the changes wrought in the inhabitants' lives thereby. Andy was required to wear a red frog costume. But why, she demanded, once this requirement was belatedly made known to her. It's tradition, Brad Bondler explained tersely. Anyone who didn't know that had no business being on stage. He snapped his little memorandum book closed and stepped away to confer with Dirk about the live geese needed for Act 2. Tradition, Andy repeated aloud. She turned and stared blankly at the backdrop being painted. Red and yellow, it was the sky over hell. Malcolm Jamaica under the influence of small pool dynamics. After killing the small man with the mustache, whose wallet was now in a pocket in his jeans, Green Purbrick chased Malcolm Jamaica down the street and into a health club. The killer had been stunned to see his target run away like that, but initially explained it to himself as some kind of clever ploy. Now, however, as he held Jamaica's head below the surface of the wading pool, he began to think that the reports he had heard of the man's prowess had been greatly exaggerated, or, he thought with a smug grin, was it that he was just so much better? Jamaica's thoughts were on the rebreather unit he held in his mouth. Would it really last as long as its manufacturer claimed? And even if it did, what then? Surely even an anti-intellectual like this killer would begin to suspect something when Jamaica failed to drown in a reasonable amount of time. He could reach his paralyzer cone, but had no idea what its effects would be if discharged underwater. If only someone would come along and save him, as so often happened in the movies. Purbrick pulled Jamaica up after the latter stopped thrashing about with a convincing display of lifelessness. That would have been his big mistake had Jamaica been able to shoot him with the cone. However, his hand couldn't clear the surface of the water. He fired anyway, reasoning that at least he and Purbrick were both in the same position, legs in the pool, heads above. The paralysis wave emitted by the cone, diffused by the water and subtly altered by its heavy chlorine content, blew the two men apart and evaporated most of the water in a blast of steam. The first to recover was Purbrick. He lunged at Jamaica, but, like something out of a movie, was stopped by a 40-pound dumbbell heaved by 62-year-old Mike Esplund. "Thank you," Jamaica cried enthusiastically. "I owe you a debt that I can never fully repay." He said this as he bent over Purbrick's unconscious form. He retrieved both the wallet Purbrick had taken from the cartel man, as well as Purbrick's own. He then added to the blood pouring from the killer by slashing his throat with a pocket knife. "What the hell are you doing?" demanded the old weightlifter. Twisted freezer whines of old-fashioned love. Prince Hopshe, out of his immense regard for Purbrick, claimed the latter's body in person from the city morgue. "Prince Hopshe, this is an honor," the attendant, a middle-aged hunchback, greeted the proud but shaken man. "For me as well," Hopshe replied, looking not at his interlocutor, but at the battered corpse. He had thought this man indestructible. Looking solemnly at the body, he had to admit that the man had been ugly. He had lied to himself, seeing Purbrick with the various women over the years, told himself that there was a sexiness there, but now he faced the truth. Purbrick looked like an ape, and those women had been trash. Prince Hopshe nodded at the two assistants he had brought with him. They hefted the body into a casket. The hunchback presented the prince with a form on a clipboard to sign. This was done, and the royal entourage left. After they had gone, the morgue attendant, whose name was Oshuna, addressed himself to Brutal, the janitor. "I think the prince had a little crush on the late Mr. Purbrick," he said. The janitor said nothing. He merely chewed his gum and leaned on his mop. "I have heard stories that the prince is a free thinker in such matters. Not an out-and-out homosexual, maybe, but a man willing to admit to himself certain feelings, whatever they may be, and not concerned with what the public thinks. Well, you can see that by the way he runs his business." He put his hand into a bag of chips and stared at the door. "Lives up there in the penthouse at the Troglodyta and sends out his paid assassins with no more concern about what the city commission thinks than he would over the cost of a bag of chips." Brutal glanced at the door and shifted his gum to the other side of his mouth. "There's nothing wrong with a man being in love with another man, you know," Oshuna added suddenly, looking at Brutal sharply. "It doesn't even have to be expressed sexually, although it often was in the old days. I'm talking about classical times, you understand. The Greeks, the Romans, hell, even the Persians. There was a brotherhood of men back then." He crunched his chips and continued, "So what if there was a little buggery involved?" While David Sanborn tootled like a muppet. Steve Sharp and Gregory Moore, later the second version of Gone, Greg Ginn's second most famous band, bashed away in counterpoint to the random images flashing on the wall behind them. So this is what they did after gone, Malcolm Jamaica mused. He was sitting in the Fishhead Lounge wearing a fake beard. He didn't care much for the clientele of the bar. It was mostly college kids. He did like the music, however. This is exactly the kind of thing David Sanborn should be doing, he thought. Jamaica didn't care for bars in the first place. They made him feel uncomfortable, but this was the only place that the Claction would agree to meet him. Old Brutowski suspects me, I'm sure of it, the Claction, also wearing a fake beard, told Jamaica. I don't understand why you don't take a job with your brothers on the portagerie. Surely it isn't some psychological aversion to gum paste and navel jellies, Jamaica wondered. Maybe it is, the lunar mouse, whose ears were concealed beneath a trendy stocking cap covered in glitter, replied seriously. But more than that, I like being my own mouse. Which is why you sort billing records for an alcoholic. That's just for now, the Claction defended his job. As soon as an opening opens up, I'll be moved to a service and installation job. I'll have my own van and be free to ride the roads. Jamaica sighed. I'm happy for you, he said. It pleases me to know your future is assured while I flee into the unknown. Better than staying here, the Claction reminded him. He handed over the forged documents and airplane tickets Jamaica had requested. Take these and may the moon look kindly upon you. Abruptly he left before the strange lachrymosity of his species could give him away. Your friend sure is hairy, a woman at an adjacent table said to Jamaica. Surely, Jamaica corrected, though the woman didn't see that. I like him that way, she nodded drunkenly. Zartori's trash imputed carrot. Zartor, capital of the Brown Cities, a federation of human settlements on Babualgo, was Malcolm Jamaica's next stop. On the long flight, he, along with the other human passengers, had taken several doses of hostilitol, a drug that would enable them to breathe the moon's air. During their stay, they would have to continue to take the drug twice a day. Jamaica hated it. It was bad enough that he already had to take three hormone replacement pills and a cholesterol blocking pill every day for the rest of his life, the former because of some unnecessary surgery that he had never received restitution for, the latter because it had become manifestly evident that he was never going to get his diet under control, without adding another one to the regimen. Stepping out onto the streets of Zartor, he inhaled his first unadulterated breath of lunar air. Despite the reassuring literature on the airplane, there was a definite odor to it, an unpleasant one to Jamaica's senses. It reminded him of any number of the aftershave concoctions favored by men of his father's generation. He knew that within a couple of days he wouldn't notice it, but for now, its distasteful associations with anachronism, authority, and assimilation gave him the creeps. This stage of his journey would turn out badly, he could feel it. In keeping with his disguise as Medford Pools, a photography realtor from virtual Vermont, he didn't take any place approaching the luxury of the Troglodyta. Instead, he lodged with Mrs. Pannier, an elderly but spry lady whose upstairs room was comfortable enough and, more importantly, had its own private entrance at the top of a flight of outside stairs. Do you know of any second-hand bookstores in the area? Jamaica asked his new landlady. My goodness, are you a reader, Mr. Pools? Mrs. Pannier asked, wide-eyed. Yes, Jamaica nodded solemnly, as if owning up to his vital role in the preservation of all civilization. Yes, I am. Well, my goodness, my last couple of tenants didn't do anything but watch the TV all day and all night. You won't hear any TV from up there while I'm here, Mrs. Pannier, Jamaica promised. Well, you know, the old man informed him, the cable bill is included with your rent. Bullets on the side, what conjuring, Mr. Editor. By Friday, Jamaica had installed a small library of paperbacks in his room. Almost every book was in the fantasy or science fiction genres. There's really only the thinnest of lines separating those two classifications, he opined to Jimmy Previtt, a fellow member of Merlin's Minions, a local discussion group for speculative fiction enthusiasts. I think that's very insightful, Previtt replied, gazing warmly at his new friend. You should take over the editorship of the group's newsletter. Merlin's Mighty Staff? Jamaica said wonderingly. That's the one. Ben Stodge, the current editor, didn't like the idea. Come on, fellas, he begged at the next meeting. I know circulation is down, but once we move to color printing, I know things will pick up. Besides, he added with more than a little desperation, the movie version of Savages on Saturn is coming out this spring. You know I've got a big special edition of The Staff planned to coincide with the release. None of these arguments, nor appeals to sentiment, moved the other 8 members of the group, all of whom had rapidly come to respect their newest member, Malcolm Jamaica. The blackest of magic, Stodge complained to his mother at breakfast. What did put a stop to the attempted transfer of the editorship was Stodge's threat to disallow any further use of his basement for the group's meetings, should this coup, as he called it, take place. Sorry about that, Jimmy told Jamaica in the street after the meeting. It's all right, brother, Jamaica assured him. I've got another maneuver in my sea chest. That's what Silac said to Minerva 23 at the end of Bridge to Zombie Town, Jimmy cried. Jamaica nodded with much authority. He said nothing more just then, but went home and began work on the creation of his own newsletter. I think I'll call it Boron's Eternal Half-Life, he said. It sounds wonderful, Mrs. Pannier agreed. Haste to Corporal Endocrine. Meanwhile, Don Durkee had abruptly ceased work on Clam in favor of a new comic he had tentatively titled Stylized Titty. It will appear in large unit savings, just like Clam did, he explained to a disinterested neighbor. I'm not giving up on the magazine. Yeah, you don't want to do that, the other man continued to water his begonias as he answered. Corporal Endocrine, the main character in the new work, explained things in more detail to the folks at home. I know folks at home is such a cliché, Endocrine said as he walked along a quiet suburban street of arts and crafts bungalows, but I dread referring to you as my readership. I feel that this will finally be the narrative angle that I've been looking for. Like Durkee, Endocrine was a heavily bearded cartoonist. Should anyone mistake him for a stand-in for his creator, however, Durkee had endowed him with a desirable girlfriend and a secret identity as a secret agent. It was rumored that Endocrine had another, more practical endowment as well, but as Durkee's parents were still alive and might actually read one of his comics someday, Durkee refrained from including material that might cause his parents to feel uncomfortable, and himself embarrassment in the face of their discomfort, or discomfort in the face of their embarrassment. Either way, it was not a mature relationship that he had with his parents. His real-life girlfriend, Padua Memphit, often chided him over this inane self-censorship, but Durkee could barely hear her when he was working on his comics. Honestly, but Padua screeched, I don't know why I still hang around with you. You pay no attention to me. You can't see beyond that piece of paper you're doodling on. Yeah, Durkee replied absently. Look, Don, Padua yelled, pointing at the window. The world is coming to an end. We're under attack. Just a minute, Durkee growled. He could hear her words, but the ones in his head were louder and made more sense. The monster reveals an opaque facet. While working on the latest installment of Boom Nutmeg, Corporal Endocrine received word that the Eyelash Consortium, one of the many evil organizations he had fought over the years, was planning to auction off the stolen plans for the Deshafter to the highest bidder. And none of those bidders will be the ones to refrain from putting the Deshafter to some nefarious purpose, Endocrine's contact Lawrence intoned greatly. What exactly is the Deshafter? Endocrine laid aside his expensive pen and asked. Well, Lawrence adjusted his bottom on the undersized stool. At this point, the Deshafter is purely theoretical. No one knows if it will really work. Oh, there are detailed blueprints, of course, but no one has ever built the device. Yes, but what does it do? Insisted the secret agent/cartoonist. One of two possible things. Lawrence counted them off on his thick, mottled fingers. 1. It will enable the user, no matter how untutored in the science of farming, to grow perfectly edible cucumbers every time. Impressive, Endocrine admitted. And the other? 2. It will enable the user to quit his job and make a living at cartooning. Lawrence said this knowing what it would mean to Endocrine. He said it evenly and without hesitation, keeping his eyes on Endocrine's. For this, Endocrine was grateful, later even going so far as to write him a letter expressing his gratitude. My God, Lawrence, that machine must never be built. He was emphatic, pounding a soft toy version of Boom Nutmeg with his powerful cartoonist's fist. Lawrence nodded. He rose from the stool. When can you leave? He asked. Immediately, Endocrine replied. Well, as soon as I finish this. He gestured at the paper on his expensive proper drawing table. I've got Boom in quite a pickle at the moment. Anything we at the agency could do to help out? Lawrence offered. Well, Endocrine tugged at his beard. Boom could always do with some sort of anti-gravity type boots. Entries 2 through 16, overshadowed by regulations. In between Merlin's Minions meetings and when he wasn't working on his newsletter, Jamaica had taken up stalking Danielle Apticus, a woman 10 years his junior who worked for the Colloquia Rodentii, an organization dedicated to improving relations with the lunar mice. Jamaica didn't care about her politics. He was fascinated with her long nose and wide mouth. Her heavy breast and tall, lean carriage were also points of interest. To think of her spine struggling under the weight of that rack, he enthused, with watering mouth. He had first encountered Danielle at the local shoe store, where he had gone as a favor to Mrs. Pannier. She had needed a pair of inserts for the men's brogans she habitually wore. Jamaica suspected that the shoes had belonged to her dead husband, but he had not yet confirmed this. Ordinarily, Jamaica would have performed a silent ritual of lust over a girl as appealing as Danielle and let it go at that. However, there was something more about her, something that attracted him beyond the sexual. He kept his eyes open when he left the store and realized that he and the young woman were heading in the same direction. When he saw where Danielle lived, he knew he had to know more about her. Danielle Aptegus lived in a C-shaped apartment house dating back to the beginnings of the previous century. It was the kind of place that Jamaica would have liked to have lived in back when he was a young man. I could have attended classes and walked back to my charming little apartment where posters of great works of art lined the walls, along with the pictures of the great men who were my heroes, he fantasized. Indeed, it was a fantasy. For Jamaica's time in college had been lonely, frustrating, and all too brief. His bitterness over those lost years, however, was something he had successfully buried. He wondered as he broke into Danielle's empty apartment if the current fruits of his life had been fertilized by the rot of that interred bitterness, or if they had rather sprung from it like a fungus from wind-blown spores. "I'm getting too contemplative," he remonstrated with himself, fingering Danielle's plain, practical cotton panties.